philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and artificial intelligence researchers who study embodied cognition and the embodied mind argue that many features of human cognition are shaped by aspects of the body beyond the brain. The features of cognition include high-level mental constructs and human performance on various cognitive tasks. The aspects of the body include the motor system, the perceptual system, the body's interactions with the environment, and the ontological assumptions about the world that are built into the body and the brain. The embodied mind thesis challenges other theories, such as cognitivism, computationalism, and Cartesian dualism. It is closely related to the extended mind thesis, situated cognition, and unactivism. The modern version depends on insights drawn from recent research in psychology, linguistics, cognitive science, dynamical systems, artificial intelligence, robotics, and neurobiology. Embodiment thesis. In philosophy, embodied cognition holds that an agent's cognition is strongly influenced by aspects of an agent's body beyond the brain itself. In the proposal for an inactive approach to cognition, Varela et al. Defined embodied. By using the term embodied, we mean to highlight 2 points. First, that cognition depends upon the kinds of experience that come from having a body with various sensory motor capacities, and second, that these individual sensory motor capacities are themselves embedded in a more encompassing biological, psychological, and cultural context. Eleanor Roche, Evan Thompson, Francisco J. Varela, The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience, pages 172 to 173. The Varela inactive definition is broad enough to overlap the views of extended cognition and situated cognition, and indeed, these ideas are not always carefully separated. For example, according to Michael Dawson, the relationship is tangled. In viewing cognition as embedded or situated, embodied cognitive science emphasizes feedback between an agent and the world. We have seen that this feedback is structured by the nature of an agent's body. This in turn suggests that agents with different kinds of bodies can be differentiated in terms of degrees of embodiment. Embodiment can be defined as the extent to which an agent can alter its environment. Citations have been omitted. Michael Dawson, Degrees of Embodiment, The Rutledge Handbook of Embodied Cognition. Page 62. Some authors explain the dependence of cognition upon the body and its environmental interactions by saying cognition in real biological systems is not an end in itself but is constrained by the system's goals and capacities. However, they argue, such constraints do not mean cognition is set by adaptive behavior alone, but cognition requires some kind of information processing, the transformation or communication of incoming information, the acquiring of which involves exploration and modification of the environment. It would be a mistake, however, to suppose that cognition consists simply of building maximally accurate representations of input information. The gaining of knowledge is a stepping stone to achieving the more immediate goal of guiding behavior in response to the system's changing surroundings. Marcin Milkowski, Explaining the Computational Mind. For the separation of embodied cognition from extended cognition and situated cognition can be based upon the embodiment thesis, a narrower view of embodiment than that of Varela et al., or that of Dawson. Embodiment thesis. Many features of cognition are embodied in that they are deeply dependent upon characteristics of the physical body of an agent, such that the agent's beyond the brain body plays a significant causal role, or a physically constitutive role, in that agent's cognitive processing. Ra Wilson and L. Foglia. Embodied Cognition in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This thesis omits direct mention of some aspects of the more encompassing biological, psychological and cultural context included by Varela et al. The extended mind thesis, in contrast with the embodiment thesis, limits cognitive processing neither to the brain nor even to the body. but extends it outward into the agent's world. Situated cognition emphasizes that this extension is not just a matter of including resources outside the head, but stresses the role of probing and modifying interaction with the agent's world. Philosophical background. In his Universal Natural History and Theory of Heaven, philosopher Immanuel Kant advocated a view of the mind-body problem and the subject-object problem with parallels to the embodied view. Some difficulties with this interpretation of Kant include the view that Kant holds the empirical, and specifically knowledge of the body, cannot support a priori transcendental claims, and the view that Kant holds that transcendental philosophy, although charged with the responsibility of explaining how we can have empirical knowledge, is not itself empirical. José Ortega y Gasset, George Santayana, Miguel Geronimino, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger and others in the broadly existential tradition have proposed philosophies of mind influencing the development of the modern embodiment thesis. The embodiment movement in artificial intelligence has fueled the embodiment argument in philosophy and a revised view of ethology. Species-typical activity patterns must be thought of as emergent phenomena in three different senses of the word. They have emerged through natural selection, by a process of maturation or learning, and from interactions between the creature's low-level activities and its species-typical environment. Horst Hendricks Janssen, Catching Ourselves in the Act. 10. These developments have also given emotions a new status in philosophy of mind as an indispensable constituent, rather than a non-essential addition to rational intellectual thought. In philosophy of mind, the idea that cognition is embodied is sympathetic with other views of cognition such as situated cognition or externalism. This is a radical move towards a total relocalization of mental processes out of the neural domain. Connections with the sciences. Embodied cognition is a topic of research in social and cognitive psychology, covering issues such as social interaction and decision-making. Embodied cognition reflects the argument that the motor system influences our cognition, just as the mind influences bodily actions. For example, when participants hold a pencil in their teeth engaging the muscles of a smile, they comprehend pleasant sentences faster than unpleasant ones, while holding a pencil between their nose and upper lip to engage the muscles of a frown has the reverse effect. George Lakoff and his collaborators have written a series of books promoting and expanding the thesis based on discoveries in cognitive science, such as conceptual metaphor and image schema. Robotics researchers such as Rodney Brooks, Hans Moravec and Rolf Pfeiffer have argued that true artificial intelligence can only be achieved by machines that have sensory and motor skills and are connected to the world through a body. The insights of these robotics researchers have in turn inspired philosophers like Andy Clark and Horst Hendricks Janssen. Neuroscientists Gerald Edelman, Antonio Damasio and others have outlined the connection between the body, individual structures in the brain and aspects of the mind such as consciousness, emotion, self-awareness and will. Biology has also inspired Gregory Bateson, Humberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, Eleanor Roche and Evan Thompson to develop a closely related version of the idea, which they call an activism. The motor theory of speech perception proposed by Alvin Liberman and colleagues at the Haskins Laboratories argues that the identification of words is embodied in perception of the bodily movements by which spoken words are made. More detail is provided in the sections that follow. Psychology. Visual search. One embodied cognition study shows that action intention can affect processing in visual search, with more orientation errors for pointing than for grasping. Participants either pointed to or grasped target objects of two colors and two orientations. There were randomized numbers of distractors as well, which differed from the target in color, orientation, or both. A tone sounded to inform participants which target orientation to find. Participants kept their eyes on a fixation point until it turned from red to the target color. The screen then lit up and the participants searched for the target, either pointing to it or grasping it. There were 2 blocks for pointing and 2 for grasping, with the order counterbalanced. Each block had 64 trials. Results from the experiment show that accuracy decreases with an increase in the number of distractors. Overall, participants made more orientation errors than color errors. There was no main effect of accuracy between the pointing and grasping conditions, but participants made significantly fewer orientation errors in the grasping condition than in the pointing condition. Color errors were the same in both conditions. Because orientation is important in grasping an object, these results fit with the researchers' hypothesis that the plan to grasp an object will aid in orientation accuracy. This supports embodied cognition because action intention can affect visual processing of task-relevant information. Distance perception. Internal states can affect distance perception, which relates to embodied cognition. Researchers randomly assigned college student participants to high choice, low choice, and control conditions. The high choice condition signed a freedom of choice consent form indicating their decision to wear a Carmen Miranda costume and walk across a busy area of campus. Low choice participants signed an experimenter choice consent form indicating the experimenter assigned the participant to wear the costume. A control group walked across campus but did not wear a costume. At the conclusion of the experiment, each participant completed a survey which asked them to estimate the distance they walked. The high-choice participants perceived the distance walked as significantly shorter than participants in the low-choice and control groups, even though they walked the same distance. The manipulation caused high-choice participants to feel responsible for the choice to walk in the embarrassing costume. This created cognitive dissonance, which refers to a discrepancy between attitudes and behaviors. High-choice participants reconciled their thoughts and actions by perceiving the distance as shorter. These results show the ability of internal states to affect perception of physical distance moved, which illustrates the reciprocal relationship of the body and mind in embodied cognition. Perspective researchers have found that when making judgments about objects in photographs, people will take the perspective of a person in the picture instead of their own. They showed college undergraduate participants one of 3 photographs and asked where one object in the picture was compared to the other object. For example, if the 2 objects were an apple and a banana, the participants would have to respond to a question about the location of the apple compared to the banana. The photographs either had no person, a person looking at the object, in this case the banana, or a person reaching for the banana. The photograph in question appeared in a larger set of questionnaires not related to the study. Results show that participants who viewed photographs that included a person were significantly more likely to respond from another's perspective than those who saw photographs with no person. There were no differences in perspective of responses for the person looking versus reaching. Participants who saw the scene without a person were significantly more likely to respond from their own perspective. This means that the presence of a person in the photograph affected the perspective used even though the question focused solely on the 2 objects. The researchers state that these results suggest disembodied cognition, in which the participants put themselves into the body of the person in the photograph. Language comprehension. The motor system is involved in language comprehension, in this case when sentences were performable by a human. There was a change in participants' overall movement of a pendulum. Researchers performed an experiment in which college undergraduate participants swung the pendulum while completing a sentence judgment task. Participants would swing the pendulum with both hands for 10 seconds before a prompt, and then a sentence would appear on the screen until the participant responded. In the control condition, participants swung the pendulum without performing the sentence judgment task. Each trial had half plausible and half implausible sentences. The plausible sentences made sense semantically, while the implausible ones did not. The performable sentences could be performed by a human, while the inanimate sentences could not. Participants responded by saying yes to the plausible sentences. Results show a significant relative phase shift, or overall change in movement of the swinging pendulum, for the performable sentences. This change did not occur for inanimate sentences or the control condition. The researchers did not expect an overall phase shift. Instead, they expected a change in the variability of movement, or the standard deviation of relative phase shift, although not entirely expected. These results support embodied cognition and show that the motor system is involved in the understanding of language. The researchers suggest that the nature of this relationship needs to be further studied to determine the exact correlation this task has to bimanual motor movements. Some researchers extend embodied cognition to include language. They describe language as a tool that aids in broadening our sense of body. For instance, when asked to identify this object, participants most often choose an object near to them. Conversely, when asked to identify that object, participants choose an object further away from them. Language allows us to distinguish between distances in more complex ways than the simple perceptual difference between near and far objects. Memory. A study examining memory and embodied cognition illustrates that people remember more of the gist of a story when they physically act it out. Researchers divided female participants randomly into 5 groups, which were read-only, writing, collaborative discussion, independent discussion, and improvisation. All participants received a monologue about teen addiction and were told to pay attention to details about the character and action in the monologue. Participants were given 5 minutes to read the monologue twice, unaware of a future recall test. In the read-only condition, participants filled out unrelated questionnaires after reading the monologue. In the writing condition, participants responded to 5 questions about the story from the perspective of the character in the monologue. They had 6 minutes to answer each question. In the collaborative discussion condition, participants responded from the character's perspective to the same questions as the writing group, but in groups of 4 or 5 women. They were also given 6 minutes per question, and everyone participated in answering each question. The independent discussion condition was the same as the collaborative discussion, except one person answered each question. In the improvisation condition, participants acted out 5 scenes from the monologue in groups of 5 women. The researchers suggest that this condition involves embodied cognition and will produce better memory for the monologue. Every participant played the main character and a supporting character once. Participants were given short prompts from lines in the monologue, which were excluded from the memory test. Participants had 2 minutes to choose characters and 4 minutes for improvisations. The recall test was the monologue with 96 words or phrases missing. Participants had to fill in the blanks as accurately as possible. Researchers gave the recall test to a group who did not read the monologue. They scored significantly lower than the other groups, which indicated that guessing was not easy. Encoding the answers to the recall test, exact words were labeled verbatim, and correct content but varied wording was labeled gist. The combination of verbatim and gist was called total memory. The improvisational group had more gist memories than any other group and had more total memory than both of the discussion groups. The results fit the researchers' hypothesis that the improvisational group would remember more because they actively rehearsed the information from the monologue. Although other groups had also elaborately encoded the information, the improvisation group remembered significantly more than the discussion groups and marginally more than the reading-only and writing groups. Simply experiencing the monologue in an active way aids in remembering the gist. There were no differences across groups for verbatim memory, which they suggest could take longer than the limited time during the experiment to develop.